15,000 years ago, humans were already moving across the same planet you stand on today. But the ground they crossed did not follow the same rules. Large parts of the northern continents were locked under ice that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Entire coastlines sat far beyond where the ocean reaches now, exposing land that has long since disappeared beneath water. Movement meant crossing spaces that no longer exist. Open plains extended across regions that are now forests or sea. Air moved differently across these surfaces, carrying fewer barriers and fewer places to hide. And across that openness, large animals were not distant or rare. They were constant. Mammoths passed through grasslands in numbers that reshaped the terrain. Predators moved without hesitation across the same routes humans depended on. Even the act of walking from one place to another required decisions that had immediate consequences. Humans were present, but they were not in control. Access to resources depended on timing, distance, and awareness. A wrong direction or a delayed reaction could shift the outcome of a single journey. This was not a world organized around human stability. It was a system already in motion. Evidence of this world remains scattered, preserved in bones, tracks, and fragments of ancient DNA. Landscapes have been reconstructed through patterns buried deep beneath the surface. But reconstruction has limits. In this story, we step back into that vanished world to see the planet as it really was and the conditions that shaped every move life made on it. Before we go any deeper, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you at home in a quiet room, out on a walk, or maybe late at night with the lights off? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy these calm, steady explorations of our planet's deep past, hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps keep these journeys going. So let's step back 15,000 years and see what the world looked like before everything changed. Time does not always move in steady, predictable lines. There are moments where it gathers itself, where vast systems hesitate between what has been and what is about to emerge. 15,000 years ago rests within one of those moments, suspended near the closing edge of the last ice age, when the long dominance of cold had begun to loosen its hold, yet had not fully released it. This period belongs to what scientists call the late Pleistocene, a stretch of time defined not by a single event, but by cycles of advance and retreat, of ice expanding across continents and then withdrawing again. For hundreds of thousands of years, these rhythms shaped the surface of the planet, pressing down mountains beneath immense weight, carving valleys with slow precision, and locking water into frozen mass. By 15,000 years ago, that cycle was nearing a turning point, though the change was uneven, almost hesitant, as if the earth itself were adjusting to a new balance. Across the northern half of the world, ice still lingered in vast formations, stretching over regions that would one day hold forests, cities, and rivers. Yet along their edges, subtle transformations had begun. Temperatures were shifting, not in a straight upward climb, but in pulses, brief intervals of warming followed by returns to cold. These fluctuations created landscapes that were neither fully frozen nor entirely free, but something in between, unstable, transitional, quietly changing beneath the sky. Within this shifting world, humans were no longer confined to a single region. They had moved outward over thousands of years, adapting to coastlines, grasslands, and colder terrains. By this time, they had reached multiple continents, spreading gradually through corridors opened by lower sea levels and exposed land. Their presence was not uniform or dense, but it was widespread, carried forward by small groups navigating an environment that offered both opportunity and constant uncertainty. What makes this moment distinct is not only the presence of humans, nor solely the retreat of ice, but the convergence of both within a narrow window of time. The planet was transitioning from one stable state to another, and within that transition, ecosystems were under pressure. Species that had evolved under colder conditions continued to thrive for a time, while new environmental patterns began to reshape the availability of food, water, and space. It was a period where survival depended on flexibility, where stability could not be assumed from one generation to the next. The atmosphere itself reflected this uncertainty. Winds moved across exposed terrain, carrying dust and fine sediments from dry regions, while other areas experienced increased moisture as ice melted and water returned to the system. Rivers shifted their paths, coastlines extended far beyond their modern limits, and entire habitats existed where there is now open sea. The planet was reorganizing itself, not abruptly, but through a series of gradual adjustments that, over time, would redefine its surface. In this context, 15,000 years ago stands as a threshold. It is close enough to the present to feel familiar, yet distant enough to belong to a different world entirely. The Ice Age had not yet fully ended, but its long era of dominance was beginning to fade. What followed would not simply replace it, but transform the conditions under which life had adapted for tens of thousands of years, setting in motion changes that would echo forward into everything that exists today. Coal did not settle evenly across the planet, nor did it arrive as a uniform blanket of ice. Instead, it revealed a world shaped by contrast, where temperature, moisture, and terrain combined into patterns that were complex and often unexpected. 15,000 years ago, global temperatures were lower than those of the present day, yet the experience of that cold varied from place to place, creating environments that could feel starkly different even within the same region. In the far reaches of the northern hemisphere, immense ice sheets remained anchored to the land, rising in thickness over thousands of years. These formations were not static. They flowed slowly under their own weight, pressing outward, grinding against the surface beneath them. As they advanced, they altered the shape of entire continents, smoothing some areas while carving deep basins into others. The presence of such ice influenced everything around it, from wind patterns to the distribution of water, setting the tone for the climates that extended beyond its edges. Yet not all cold places were dominated by ice. In many regions, especially those lying just beyond the reach of these massive formations, conditions were dry rather than frozen solid. Precipitation was limited, and the air carried little moisture, leaving the ground exposed and firm. These areas supported wide expanses of hardy vegetation, plants adapted to survive with minimal water and short growing seasons. The landscape here did not resemble a frozen wasteland, but something more open, where the horizon stretched uninterrupted and the ground held a quiet resilience. This balance between cold and dryness created ecosystems that were distinct from those found in warmer times. Forests were less widespread, replaced in many areas by grasslands and low vegetation that could endure the harsher conditions. The absence of dense tree cover allowed light to reach the ground more directly, supporting a different arrangement of life. Species that thrived here were adapted not only to temperature but to scarcity, capable of enduring long periods where resources were limited and conditions could shift without warning. Water, though present, followed different paths. With large amounts locked within ice, rivers often carried less volume, and some regions experienced seasonal flows that depended on gradual melting. Wetlands formed in certain areas where conditions allowed, creating pockets of richer life amid the broader dryness. These variations gave rise to a mosaic of habitats, each shaped by the interplay between cold air, limited moisture, and the slow movement of ice across the land. The atmosphere itself reflected these patterns. Winds moved more freely across open terrain, unbroken by dense forests, carrying fine particles of dust that settled over distant regions. This constant movement influenced soil composition, distributing nutrients in subtle ways that would shape plant growth over time. Even in the cold, there was a quiet dynamism, a continuous exchange between land and air that sustained the ecosystems within it. In this world, life persisted not in spite of the cold, but within it, shaped by its constraints and guided by its rhythms. The planet was colder, but it was not empty. It held a diversity that emerged from limitation, where each element, from ice to wind to soil, played a role in defining the living systems that moved across its surface. Water had withdrawn from the edges of the continents, revealing a version of the Earth that no longer exists. Where waves now move in steady rhythm, there were once wide stretches of exposed ground, shaped by wind and time rather than tides. 15,000 years ago, sea levels were significantly lower, held back by immense volumes of water stored within distant ice. The oceans had not disappeared, but they had retreated, pulling shorelines outward and uncovering land that would later be submerged again. These newly revealed regions formed vast extensions of the continents, altering their outlines in ways that would feel unfamiliar today. Coastal plains stretched far beyond their present limits, creating broad, flat expanses where marine waters had once stood. In some areas, these plains sloped gently toward the horizon, while in others, they were marked by shallow valleys and ridges, remnants of earlier geological processes. Rivers extended across this exposed land, carving channels that would eventually be lost beneath rising seas, their paths preserved only in subtle traces beneath the ocean floor. Between continents, connections emerged. One of the most significant was the region known as Beringia, a wide land bridge that linked northeastern Asia to what is now Alaska. This was not a narrow crossing, but a broad and habitable landscape shaped by cold and dryness, supporting vegetation and life adapted to those conditions. It existed for thousands of years, offering a route not only for animals, but for human populations moving gradually into new territories. Movement across this land did not occur as a single event, but as a slow and continuous process, guided by changing resources and shifting environments. Elsewhere, similar connections appeared in different forms. Islands that are now separated by water were once joined to larger landmasses, creating continuous stretches of terrain where movement could occur without interruption. These changes allowed species to expand their ranges, following pathways that no longer exist. Migration was not limited to seasonal patterns, but extended across generations as populations spread into regions that would later become isolated by rising seas. The altered coastlines influenced more than movement alone. They shaped the distribution of ecosystems, creating environments that blended elements of inland and coastal life. Areas near the former shorelines supported a mix of plant and animal communities, adapted to conditions that combined exposure, limited moisture, and occasional flooding. These transitional zones added complexity to the broader landscape, offering both opportunity and challenge to the species that lived within them. As time moved forward, the balance began to shift. Gradual warming contributed to the melting of ice, releasing water back into the oceans. The exposed plains began to narrow, their edges slowly reclaimed by rising seas. Rivers shortened, coastlines retreated, and the connections between continents were submerged once more. The pathways that had allowed movement across vast distances were closed, leaving populations separated where they had once been continuous. In this earlier world, the shape of the Earth's surface was not fixed. It expanded and contracted with the movement of water, revealing and concealing land over long spans of time. The lower seas created a geography that encouraged connection, allowing life to move, adapt, and spread across regions that are now divided. What remains today is only a fragment of that shifting landscape, a reminder that even the boundaries between land and ocean are part of a larger, ongoing transformation. The land did not close in around itself the way it often does now. Instead of dense layers of trees and shadow, there were wide, uninterrupted surfaces where the horizon remained visible for great distances, gently curving with the shape of the earth. 15,000 years ago, much of the northern world was dominated by a biome known as steppe tundra, a blend of grassland and cold adapted vegetation that formed one of the most expansive, continuous ecosystems in recent geological history. This environment was defined not by a single type of plant, but by a mixture that could endure both low temperatures and limited moisture. Grasses grew in clusters, interwoven with hardy shrubs, small flowering plants, and patches of moss. The ground itself remained firm for much of the year, sometimes frozen below the surface, creating a stable platform that supported movement across long distances. Unlike modern tundra, which can be sparse and fragile, this landscape held a surprising productivity, sustained by seasonal bursts of growth during warmer intervals. Forests existed, but they were restricted to specific regions where conditions allowed for more consistent moisture and slightly milder temperatures. Across much of the steppe tundra, trees were rare or absent, unable to establish themselves in soil that was often too dry or too cold to support their long-term growth. This absence opened the land, allowing wind to move freely and sunlight to reach every part of the surface. The result was a world that felt expansive, where nothing stood tall enough to block the view for long. In such an environment, visibility became a defining feature of life. Movement could be seen from far away, long before sound or scent carried any warning. Animals crossing these plains were often visible as distant forms against the horizon, their presence gradually becoming clearer as they approached. This openness shaped behavior, influencing how species interacted, how they moved, and how they avoided or engaged with one another. The conditions of the steppe tundra favored animals of considerable size. Large bodies retained heat more efficiently, an advantage in colder climates where energy conservation was essential. At the same time, the vastness of the land supported wide-ranging movement, allowing herds to travel in search of food across distances that smaller, more confined environments could not sustain. The vegetation, though not towering, was spread over immense areas, creating a resource base that could support large populations of grazing animals. These animals, in turn, influenced the landscape itself. As they moved, they grazed, trampled, and disturbed the soil, preventing certain plants from dominating and allowing grasses to regenerate. Their presence maintained the openness of the environment, creating a dynamic balance between vegetation and movement. This interaction was continuous, a quiet shaping of the land through daily activity rather than sudden change. Predators adapted to this openness as well, developing strategies suited to a world without cover. Some relied on endurance, following herds over long distances, while others used coordination, working in groups to isolate and pursue individual targets. The absence of dense vegetation meant that concealment was limited, shifting the balance towards speed, strength, and timing rather than ambush. Within this broad and open world, life unfolded across a scale that is difficult to encounter today. The steppe tundra stretched across continents, connecting regions that now feel separate, creating a continuous stage where movement, survival, and interaction played out beneath an unobstructed sky. Size, in this earlier world, was not an accident or an exaggeration of form, but a quiet solution shaped over long spans of time. Bodies grew larger because the conditions around them favored that change, guiding evolution toward proportions that could endure what smaller forms could not. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated across different lineages, creating a landscape where scale itself became part of survival. In colder climates, heat was a constant concern, not as a sudden threat, but as a steady drain on energy. Larger bodies lose heat more slowly than smaller ones, their volume increasing faster than their surface area. This relationship allowed massive animals to conserve warmth with greater efficiency, reducing the energy required to maintain stable internal conditions. Fat layers, thick skin, and dense coverings further supported this balance, forming a barrier between internal warmth and the surrounding cold. Energy efficiency extended beyond temperature alone. Large animals could travel long distances with a steadier use of energy, their movements more economical over time. In environments where food was spread across vast areas rather than concentrated in dense patches, this ability became essential. A larger body could store energy reserves during periods of abundance and draw upon them when conditions became less favorable, smoothing out the irregular rhythm of resource availability. The scale of these animals also shaped how they interacted with one another. Predators and prey evolved together within this framework, each influencing the form and behavior of the other. For a predator, bringing down a large herbivore required strength, coordination, and often persistence over extended periods. This favored the development of physical power and, in some cases, social cooperation. For prey species, size offered a form of defense, making them more difficult to overpower and less vulnerable to smaller attackers. These interactions unfolded across open and expansive terrain where encounters were influenced by visibility and movement rather than concealment. Herds could move together, forming groups that reduced individual risk, while predators adapted to follow, track, and select their targets with care. The balance between them was not static, but continuously adjusted through generations, each small advantage shaping the next. Underlying all of this was the slow pace of evolution, operating over timescales far beyond immediate observation. Genetic variations that supported larger size, improved insulation, or more efficient movement were gradually reinforced as individuals carrying those traits survived and reproduced. Over many generations, these changes accumulated, producing species that seemed almost defined by their scale, though each step in that process was incremental and grounded in survival. Environmental stability also played a role. The conditions that favored large size persisted long enough for these adaptations to become established. Though climates shifted over time, the broader pattern of cold and open landscapes provided a consistent backdrop against which these traits remained advantageous. This allowed large-bodied species to not only emerge, but to thrive, becoming integral parts of their ecosystems. In this way, the presence of giant animals was not simply a feature of the past, but a reflection of how life responds to its surroundings. Size became a language through which survival was expressed, shaped by temperature, distance, and interaction, written slowly into the forms that moved across the land. Across the open ground, certain shapes rose above all others, not through sudden motion, but through steady presence, as if the land itself had gathered into living form. The woolly mammoth moved with a measured rhythm, its body carrying a weight that pressed softly into the earth with each step, leaving impressions that lingered long after it had passed. It was not only large, but structured for endurance, built to exist within a climate that demanded constant balance between exposure and survival. Its size was considerable, with individuals reaching heights that placed them above most other animals of their time. Beneath a dense covering of long, coarse hair lay a thick layer of insulating fat, forming a barrier against cold that extended across its entire body. The outer fur, often layered and uneven, trapped air close to the skin, while beneath it a softer undercoat provided additional protection. Even its ears and tail were reduced in size compared to relatives in warmer regions, minimizing heat loss and preserving internal warmth through long periods of low temperature. Movement was not hurried, yet it was continuous. Mammoths traveled in groups, following paths that shifted with the seasons, guided by the availability of food and the subtle changes in the landscape. These migrations were not random, but patterned over time, shaped by memory and the accumulated experience of generations. Routes extended across wide territories, connecting areas that offered grazing during different parts of the year, allowing herds to sustain themselves within an environment where resources were rarely concentrated in one place. Their diet consisted primarily of grasses and low vegetation, which they gathered in large quantities each day. The structure of their tusks, long and curved, allowed them to sweep aside snow or break through compacted surfaces to reach what lay beneath. These movements altered the ground itself, clearing areas and exposing layers of vegetation that might otherwise remain buried. In this way, their feeding behavior extended beyond simple consumption, influencing the distribution and growth of plants across the regions they inhabited. Social structure played a central role in their lives. Herds were typically organized around groups of females and their young, led by older individuals whose experience guided the movement and decisions of the group. This arrangement created a continuity of knowledge, where migration, routes, feeding grounds, and responses to environmental changes were carried forward across generations. Younger members remained close, learning through proximity and repetition, while adult males often moved separately, joining the group only at certain times. The presence of these herds shaped the environment in ways that extended beyond immediate interaction. As they moved, they compacted soil, dispersed seeds, and maintained open areas by feeding on emerging vegetation. Their activity prevented certain plants from dominating, supporting a balance that allowed grasslands to persist. In regions where mammoths were abundant, the landscape itself reflected their influence, carrying the marks of repeated passage and continuous grazing. They existed not as isolated creatures, but as part of a larger system, their scale integrated into the rhythms of the world around them. The woolly mammoth stood as one of the most recognizable forms of this time, not because it was separate from its environment, but because it expressed that environment so completely. Its size, behavior, and presence shaped by the same forces that defined the land it moved across. Where the land gathered into thicker growth and the ground held more moisture, another presence moved with a different rhythm, less visible from a distance, more absorbed into the spaces between trunks and branches. The mastodon belonged to these regions, shaped not for wide, open travel, but for a life among clustered vegetation where movement followed narrower paths and feeding occurred at varying heights. At a glance, it shared certain features with the mammoth: a large body, elongated tusks, and a general form that reflected a distant common ancestry. Yet its structure carried important differences, subtle but meaningful. The mastodon's body was often more compact, its limbs proportioned for stability within uneven terrain rather than extended migration across open ground. Its skull and teeth revealed perhaps the clearest distinction. Instead of the broad, Ridged molars suited for grinding grasses, mastodons possessed cusped teeth, raised and pointed, adapted for crushing and tearing tougher plant material. This difference in dentition reflected a shift in diet and, by extension, in habitat. Mastodons fed primarily on shrubs, branches, leaves, and bark, browsing rather than grazing. Their tusks were used not only for display or defense, but also to manipulate vegetation, pulling down limbs or stripping bark where necessary. Feeding occurred within the layered structure of forested environments, where food sources were distributed vertically as much as they were spread across the ground. The forests they inhabited were not continuous in the way modern woodlands often appear, but existed in patches and corridors where moisture and soil conditions allowed trees to establish. Within these areas, the mastodon moved with deliberate pacing, navigating through stands of growth that offered both shelter and sustenance. Their presence was quieter than that of their open land counterparts, not in sound alone, but in how they occupied space, less visible from afar, more integrated into the textures of their surroundings. Across North America, mastodons were widely distributed, occupying regions that provided suitable vegetation and access to water. Their range extended through eastern and central parts of the continent, following the availability of forested habitats as these environments shifted over time. Like other large animals of the period, their movement patterns were influenced by seasonal changes, though their reliance on woody plants often tied them more closely to specific areas than species that depended on open grasslands. Their role within these ecosystems was significant. By feeding on shrubs and young trees, mastodons influenced the structure of the forest itself, limiting the density of certain plants and allowing others to persist. This browsing behavior created variation within the landscape, opening spaces within thicker growth and contributing to a dynamic balance between different types of vegetation. Their movement through these areas also aided in the dispersal of seeds, carried within their digestive systems or transported on their bodies. In this quieter, more enclosed world, the mastodon existed as a counterpart to the giants of the open land, shaped by a different set of conditions, yet equally integrated into the rhythms of its environment. Its presence added depth to the ecosystems of the time, extending the influence of large animals into regions where visibility narrowed and the land held a different kind of complexity. There are moments when motion becomes focused into a single, deliberate act, where power gathers not in distance covered, but in the precision of contact. Among the predators of this world, the saber-toothed cats embodied that kind of design, their bodies shaped not for prolonged pursuit, but for controlled force delivered at exactly the right moment. Smilodon, one of the most well-known among them, carried this approach in every part of its form. Its build was distinct from many modern large cats. The limbs were thick and heavily muscled, the chest broad, the frame compact yet powerful. Rather than relying on sustained speed across long stretches, it was adapted for grappling, for bringing prey to the ground through strength and leverage. The forelimbs, in particular, suggest an ability to hold and restrain, to anchor a struggle in place rather than chase it across open terrain. Movement was still important, but it was the final engagement that defined its success. At the center of its appearance were the elongated canine teeth, extending well beyond those of other predators. These teeth were not designed for crushing bone or enduring prolonged pressure. Their structure indicates a more specialized function, one that required careful use. When the moment of attack arrived, the jaws opened wide, guided by a skull capable of accommodating such extension, and the canines were directed towards softer regions of the prey's body. The aim was not to tear indiscriminately, but to deliver a precise and deep wound, one that could quickly disrupt vital functions. This method required control as much as strength. A misjudged strike could damage the teeth themselves, and fossil evidence suggests that such injuries did occur. Broken or worn canines have been found, indicating that these predators lived with the risks inherent in their specialization. Yet the frequency of healed injuries also suggests resilience, individuals surviving long enough for bones to mend, continuing within the same demanding environment. The prey they targeted were often large, requiring coordination between timing and force. Smilodon likely approached closely before initiating an attack, minimizing the need for extended pursuit. Once contact was made, its powerful limbs would have played a crucial role in subduing movement, allowing the jaws to be positioned with care. This sequence reflects a strategy built around short, intense interactions rather than drawn out chases. Evidence for this behavior emerges not only from skeletal structure, but from the patterns observed in fossil assemblages. Sites where multiple individuals have been preserved together, such as ancient tar seeps, provide glimpses into how these animals lived and died. Bones bearing signs of stress, healed fractures, and wear patterns reveal a life that balanced risk and adaptation, where each successful hunt contributed to survival in a landscape shaped by large and capable prey. Within this system, the saber-toothed cats occupied a role defined by precision. Their design did not aim to match speed over distance, but to master the brief and critical moment of engagement. Every aspect of their anatomy, from muscle to tooth, reflects a narrowing of function, a refinement toward a particular way of interacting with the world around them. In this way, Smilodon and its relatives represent a different path within predation, one where success depended not on covering ground, but on understanding exactly when and how to act, allowing strength and structure to converge in a single, decisive movement. At certain distances, scale becomes difficult to measure, a figure on the landscape that seems almost still until it shifts, revealing proportions that exceed expectation. The short-faced bear moved with that kind of presence, its height alone altering how space was perceived around it. When standing upright, it could rise to a level that placed its head well above many other large animals, its long limbs extending its reach and stride in ways that set it apart from other predators of its time. Its body was built with a combination of height and mass that made it one of the largest terrestrial carnivores to exist. The limbs were elongated compared to those of modern bears, giving it a more elevated stance and a gait suited for covering ground efficiently. This structure has led to estimates suggesting it could move at notable speed for its size, not in brief bursts alone, but across longer distances with a steady, powerful rhythm. Each step carried weight, yet also a sense of momentum, allowing it to traverse open terrain in search of opportunity. The skull, relatively short in length but broad and strong, reflects a bite capable of processing a wide range of food sources. Unlike more specialized predators, the short-faced bear appears to have occupied a flexible role within its environment. This has led to ongoing discussion among researchers regarding its primary behavior, whether it actively hunted large prey, relied heavily on scavenging, or combined both strategies depending on circumstance. Evidence from bone wear and isotopic analysis suggests a varied diet, one that may have shifted with availability rather than adhering to a single pattern. Within the broader ecosystem, its presence alone may have influenced the behavior of other animals. Size can function as a form of interaction before any direct contact occurs. A predator of such scale would not need to engage in frequent conflict to assert its position. The simple act of approaching a carcass or moving through an area could displace smaller predators, altering feeding opportunities without direct confrontation. In this way, it may have functioned as both participant and regulator, its movements shaping access to resources across the landscape. The environment in which it lived provided both space and challenge. Large prey animals were present, but so were other capable predators, each adapted to their own strategies. Within this network, the short faced bear occupied a role that did not rely solely on pursuit or ambush. Its size allowed it to operate across multiple situations, from investigating the remains of a recent kill to potentially overpowering prey under the right conditions. Flexibility, supported by strength, appears to have been a defining aspect of its existence. Fossil remains, though limited in number compared to some other species, offer glimpses into this life. Bones recovered from various sites show a distribution that spans significant portions of the continent, suggesting a range that followed the availability of resources rather than fixed territories. The structure of these remains supports the idea of an animal adapted for both movement and dominance, capable of interacting with its environment in ways that extended beyond simple predator prey dynamics. In the quiet balance of this world, the short faced bear stood as a form that carried both possibility and presence, its scale influencing not only what it could do, but how other animals responded to its existence within the shared landscape. Across certain stretches of land, movement did not belong to a single body, but to many, coordinated in a way that blurred the line between individual and group. Dire wolves moved within this shared rhythm, their presence defined less by solitary action and more by collective intent. They were larger and more heavily built than most modern wolves, their frames reinforced with dense bone and muscle that suggested strength over long pursuit rather than lightness or speed alone. Their limbs carried them with purpose, not in scattered motion, but in alignment with others of their kind. Evidence drawn from fossil remains indicates that they did not operate in isolation. The repeated discovery of multiple individuals within the same sites, often preserved together, points toward a social structure where cooperation shaped survival. These were not accidental gatherings, but reflections of a way of life in which hunting, movement, and response to the environment were shared across the group. The structure of their teeth and jaws supports this pattern. Their dentition was robust, capable of processing bone as well as flesh, suggesting that once a kill was made, little was left unused. Such efficiency would have been essential in an environment where competition for resources was constant. The strength of their bite, combined with their collective behavior, allowed them to take on prey that might have been difficult for a single individual to manage. Hunting as a group introduced a different set of dynamics into the landscape. Rather than relying on a single decisive moment, dire wolves could extend an encounter, applying pressure through persistence and coordination. Individuals within the pack may have taken on different roles, some focusing on directing movement, others on closing distance, gradually exhausting their target. This method did not depend solely on speed, but on endurance and the ability to act in concert. They did not exist without challenge. Other predators occupied the same regions, each adapted to its own strategy, each capable of contesting access to food. Encounters between these species were likely shaped by both opportunity and risk. A pack of dire wolves could present a formidable presence, yet larger or more specialized predators might still assert dominance under certain conditions. The balance between them shifted with circumstance, influenced by numbers, terrain, and timing. One of the clearest windows into their lives comes from ancient tar seeps, where animals drawn by the presence of trapped prey became ensnared themselves. Over time, these sites accumulated the remains of numerous species, but among them, dire wolves appear in remarkable numbers. Their abundance within these deposits suggests not only that they were widespread, but that their social behavior may have led them to approach such situations together, increasing the likelihood of multiple individuals becoming trapped. The bones recovered from these sites often show signs of wear, healed injuries, and stress, indicating lives that involved repeated strain and recovery. Fractures that had mended suggest that individuals were able to survive periods of difficulty, perhaps supported by the group during times when hunting alone would have been impossible. This resilience reflects a system where survival was not carried by one body alone, but distributed across the pack. In this shared existence, the dire wolf embodied a different approach to predation, one that relied on connection and coordination as much as physical strength. Its presence extended beyond the individual, shaping the landscape through the collective movement of many, bound together within a single, continuous rhythm. Some forms in this world did not rely on speed or distance at all, but on presence held in place, a kind of still strength that altered the space around it simply by remaining. The giant ground sloth moved within this slower rhythm, its body large enough to rival that of other towering animals, yet carried with a different intent, less directed toward pursuit and more toward endurance and reach. Its size alone placed it among the largest land mammals of its time, with certain species standing upright to heights comparable to elephants when supported by their hind limbs and tail. This posture was not rare or exceptional, but a regular part of how it interacted with its environment. The hind legs, combined with a broad, sturdy tail, formed a tripod structure that allowed the front limbs to extend upward, pulling branches downward or stripping leaves from higher growth that smaller animals could not access. Movement across the ground was measured and deliberate. The limbs were strong but not built for speed, each step placed with a certain care that reflected both weight and structure. Yet this slower pace did not indicate vulnerability. The forelimbs, equipped with long, curved claws, were capable of delivering powerful strikes. These claws, used in feeding to draw vegetation closer, could also serve as a form of defense, creating a barrier that few predators would approach without risk. Size, combined with this capability, provided a level of protection that reduced the need for rapid escape. The vegetation it consumed differed from that of grazing animals, focusing more on leaves, branches, and higher plant material. By feeding at different levels, the giant ground sloth occupied a niche that complemented other large herbivores, reducing direct competition while contributing to the shaping of plant communities. Its browsing could influence the growth patterns of trees and shrubs, opening spaces in some areas while allowing others to thicken, creating a varied structure within the landscape. Fossil evidence suggests that these animals lived across broad regions, with remains found in both North and South America. Their distribution reflects an ability to adapt to a range of environments, from more open areas to regions with greater vegetation density. Within these spaces, they existed as part of a larger system, their presence integrated into the balance between plant growth and consumption. Traces of interaction between giant ground sloths and humans have also been preserved, offering glimpses into encounters that occurred within this shared world. Marks on bones, patterns of butchery, and the placement of remains within archaeological sites indicate that humans were not only aware of these animals, but engaged with them directly. Such interactions would have required careful approach, given the size and defensive capabilities of the sloth, suggesting a level of coordination and planning within human groups. These moments, preserved in fragments of bone and subtle markings, reflect a connection between species that existed within the same landscape, each adapting to the presence of the other. The giant ground sloth, with its slow movement and considerable strength, occupied a space that was neither passive nor aggressive, but steady, defined by its ability to persist within the conditions around it. In this way, it contributed to the broader fabric of life during this period, not through speed or dominance alone, but through a quieter influence, shaping the environment through its feeding, its movement, and its continued presence across generations. In some regions, protection took on a form so complete that the boundary between body and shelter became almost indistinguishable. The glyptodon carried its defense with it at all times, a living structure shaped into a dome of hardened bone that enclosed nearly its entire form. From a distance, it could resemble part of the ground itself, a rounded mass resting low, its presence revealed only when it shifted slowly forward. These animals were distant relatives of modern armadillos, though their scale was far greater, reaching sizes comparable to small vehicles. The shell, composed of fused bony plates known as osteoderms, formed a continuous surface across the back and sides, creating a barrier that resisted penetration. Each plate fit tightly with the next, producing a rigid covering that allowed little flexibility but offered substantial protection. The head was partially shielded as well, while the tail, in some species, carried additional reinforcement, forming a heavy extension that could be used to deter approach. Movement was steady rather than rapid, the limbs positioned to support weight rather than speed. The feet pressed firmly into the ground, guiding the body forward with a deliberate pace. This slower movement did not place the glyptodon at a disadvantage in the way it might for other animals, as its primary defense did not rely on escape. Instead, it relied on endurance and resistance, presenting a form that was difficult to attack and even more difficult to penetrate. Predators encountering such an animal would have faced a challenge that required more than force alone. The shell limited access to vulnerable areas, leaving only smaller openings around the underside or the joints of the limbs. Attempting to overturn the animal or reach beneath it would have required significant effort and coordination, increasing the risk to the predator. In this way, the glyptodon reduced the likelihood of attack not through speed or concealment, but by altering the cost of engagement for those around it. Its diet consisted primarily of low-growing vegetation gathered from the ground as it moved across its environment. The head remained close to the surface, feeding on grasses and other plants that spread across the landscape. This feeding behavior, combined with its size, contributed to the shaping of plant communities, maintaining open areas and influencing the distribution of vegetation over time. Glyptodons were most prominent in South America, where they formed part of ecosystems that differed in structure from those found further north. These regions supported a range of large herbivores and predators, each adapted to local conditions of climate and terrain. Within this context, the glyptodon occupied a distinct role, its armored form allowing it to exist alongside more mobile and aggressive species without direct competition in the same way. The shell itself grew over the lifetime of the animal, thickening and strengthening as it aged. This gradual development reflects a life strategy built on longevity, where survival across years contributed more to success than rapid reproduction or constant movement. Each season added to its protection, reinforcing the barrier between its internal structure and the external world. In this form, the glyptodon represents a different expression of survival, one that does not depend on speed, stealth, or dominance, but on the creation of a boundary so complete that interaction becomes limited. It moved through its environment as both organism and enclosure, its presence shaped by the same forces that shaped the land, yet carried within a form that seemed to resist those forces with quiet persistence. In certain places, the air above remained open, yet the creatures that once might have filled it instead moved across the ground, carrying with them the outline of wings that no longer lifted them into flight. These were birds shaped by a different set of conditions, where height and speed replaced the need for sustained movement through the sky. Their bodies grew larger, their legs stronger, and their presence shifted from overhead passage to direct participation within the landscapes they inhabited. Among these forms were the so-called terror birds, built with long limbs and powerful frames that supported rapid movement across open terrain. Their heads carried strong, curved beaks, capable of delivering force with precision. Rather than pursuing prey through extended aerial tracking, they relied on ground-based speed and timing, closing distance with controlled bursts of motion. The structure of their legs suggests an ability to accelerate quickly, maintaining balance and direction as they approached their target. Once within range, the beak became the primary tool, delivering strikes that could incapacitate smaller animals with efficiency. In regions where large mammalian predators were absent or limited, these birds occupied roles that might otherwise have been filled by different groups. They became central figures within their ecosystems, shaping the behavior of prey species and influencing patterns of movement across the land. Without the need to compete directly with large mammalian carnivores, they were able to expand into niches that allowed them to dominate certain environments, particularly in parts of South America where isolation had guided evolution along distinct paths. Elsewhere, other flightless birds followed different strategies. The moa, found in regions far removed from continental ecosystems, adapted to a life without significant terrestrial predators for much of their history. Their bodies grew tall and heavy, their necks extending upward to reach vegetation that lay beyond the grasp of smaller animals. Movement was steady, guided more by feeding than by avoidance, as the absence of large predators reduced the immediate pressures that shaped behavior in other parts of the world. These variations reflect how the loss of flight did not represent a limitation, but a redirection of form and function. Wings, though reduced or altered, still contributed to balance and display, while the rest of the body adapted to life on the ground. The environments in which these birds lived provided the conditions necessary for such transformations, whether through isolation, absence of competition, or the availability of resources suited to their size and behavior. Over time, the patterns that supported these species began to change. As climates shifted and new pressures emerged, including the arrival of humans in regions that had long remained isolated, these birds faced challenges that their previous adaptations could not fully address. Evidence of their decline appears in the fossil record and in the absence of living representatives where they once thrived. Bones found in various conditions, some bearing marks of interaction, suggest that their disappearance was not the result of a single cause, but a combination of environmental change and new forms of predation. In this quiet transformation, the skies they once defined in absence remained, while their forms receded from the land. The ground retained traces of their passage, subtle imprints carried forward in layers of sediment and memory, marking a time when flightless birds stood among the dominant figures of their world, shaping it in ways that no longer unfold today. At the edges of rivers, along shallow rises in the land, and within temporary clearings shaped by use rather than permanence, traces of human presence begin to gather, subtle at first, then gradually more defined. These were not large settlements or fixed structures, but small, moving groups whose existence left behind fragments, stone shaped by deliberate hands, charcoal marking the remains of controlled fire, and bones arranged in patterns that reflect intention rather than chance. By this time, humans had already extended their reach across multiple continents, following paths that opened through changing landscapes and shifting boundaries. Movement was not sudden, but slow and continuous, carried across generations. Groups advanced, paused, adapted, and moved again, guided by the availability of resources and the need to remain within environments that could support them. Their presence expanded into regions where unfamiliar conditions required new responses, shaping behavior through experience rather than design. Tools formed an essential part of this adaptation. Stone was worked into edges capable of cutting, scraping, and shaping other materials, allowing for more efficient use of what the environment provided. Wood, bone, and fiber were incorporated where available, creating implements suited to hunting, processing food, and constructing temporary shelters. These tools were not uniform, but varied across regions, reflecting both local resources and the gradual transmission of knowledge within and between groups. Survival depended on awareness and cooperation. Movement across the landscape required attention to subtle changes, shifts in weather, patterns of animal behavior, and the availability of water. Groups functioned collectively, sharing tasks and maintaining a balance between mobility and stability. Fire provided warmth and a degree of protection, but also transformed food, making it easier to consume and increasing the range of what could be used as a resource. Within this environment, humans did not exist apart from other large animals, but alongside them. Encounters would have been shaped by both opportunity and risk, with each species responding to the presence of the other. Large herbivores offered potential sources of food, though obtaining them required planning and coordination. Predators, already adapted to the same landscapes, introduced additional layers of caution, influencing how and where human groups moved. Archaeological evidence preserves these interactions in fragments that, when combined, form a broader picture of coexistence. Cut marks on bones indicate the processing of animals, while the distribution of tools within sites suggests areas of repeated use. Hearths mark locations where groups gathered, their placement reflecting both practical needs and environmental conditions. Footprints, preserved in certain regions, provide more immediate traces, showing moments where humans and other animals occupied the same ground within a shared span of time. These records do not present a complete account, but they reveal patterns of adaptation and persistence. Humans adjusted to a world already shaped by large and established species, finding ways to exist within it without dominating it. Their impact was present, yet not overwhelming, part of a broader system in which multiple forms of life interacted across shifting landscapes. In this gradual unfolding, the entry of humans into these regions becomes less a single event and more a continuous presence, woven into the movements of the world around them. Their tools, their pathways, and their traces remain as quiet indicators of a species learning to exist within a landscape defined by forces far older than itself. A human figure in this world did not stand apart from its surroundings, but remained within them, subject to the same forces that shaped every other living form. Strength existed, but it was limited. Speed was present, but not exceptional. Against the scale and capability of other species, the human body alone did not define advantage. Survival depended on something less visible, carried not in size or teeth, but in shared behavior and the ability to adapt through cooperation. Movement across the landscape required caution. Each step into unfamiliar ground carried the possibility of encounter, not only with prey, but with predators that were already established within these environments. The senses were constantly engaged, reading subtle changes in sound, movement, and scent. Awareness was not a momentary state, but a continuous process maintained throughout travel, rest, and activity. Hunting, when it occurred, was not a simple act of pursuit. Large animals could not be approached without preparation, and smaller prey required patience and timing. Tools extended the reach of the human body, but their effectiveness depended on how they were used. Coordination within the group allowed for strategies that would not have been possible alone, positioning, timing, and shared roles contributing to outcomes that relied on more than individual effort. At the same time, humans existed within the range of other predators, species capable of detecting, pursuing, and overpowering them under the right conditions. Encounters with such animals would have required immediate response, not through confrontation, but through avoidance, retreat, or collective defense. The presence of multiple individuals increased the likelihood of detection and response, creating a form of protection that no single person could provide. Fire introduced another layer of interaction with the environment. It offered warmth and extended activity beyond daylight, but also created a boundary that many animals would hesitate to cross. Its light altered the immediate surroundings, changing how space was perceived and used. Maintaining fire required attention and knowledge, the ability to sustain it over time and to transport it when moving between locations. It became both a tool and a focal point around which group activity could organize. Cooperation extended beyond hunting and defense. It shaped how food was shared, how knowledge was passed, and how decisions were made. Individuals contributed in different ways, some focusing on gathering, others on tool preparation, others on observation and guidance. This distribution of roles created a network of interdependence, where the success of the group relied on the contributions of many rather than the dominance of one. Evidence of this way of life appears in the arrangement of sites where humans gathered. Tools found together, remains of fires, and patterns of discarded material suggest repeated use of certain locations, chosen for their advantages in shelter, visibility, or access to resources. These places were not permanent in the modern sense, but they reflect an understanding of the landscape and an ability to return to areas that supported survival. Within this broader system, humans existed as one part among many, capable and adaptable, yet not in control of the forces around them. Their presence was defined by balance between risk and response, between vulnerability and cooperation. It was within this balance that they continued, not as dominant figures, but as participants shaped by the same world that shaped everything else. The distance between human and giant could close in an instant, not as a gradual approach, but as a decision carried out with careful timing. When humans turned their attention toward animals of immense size, the act was never casual. It required preparation that began long before any direct encounter, shaped by observation, memory, and the ability to move together with shared intent. Evidence of these encounters remains in the quiet record of bone and stone. Mammoth remains bearing cut marks reveal patterns that align with deliberate processing, not random scavenging. In some locations, clusters of bones appear in arrangements that suggest coordinated effort, where multiple individuals participated in the handling of a single large animal. The presence of tools within these sites, positioned near areas of butchery, indicates that the sequence of action was structured, carried out with a clear understanding of each stage. To bring down such an animal, strength alone would not have been sufficient. The scale of the prey demanded coordination, a convergence of roles within the group. Some individuals may have directed movement, others maintained position, while others prepared tools or anticipated the next step. Timing was critical, as the opportunity to act would have been brief, shaped by the behavior of the animal and the conditions of the surrounding land. Terrain played a central role in these efforts. Natural features such as slopes, soft ground, or confined spaces could be used to limit the movement of large animals, reducing their advantage in size and strength. By guiding a mammoth toward such areas, humans could alter the balance of the encounter, creating conditions where the animal's ability to maneuver was reduced. In some cases, evidence suggests the use of constructed elements, simple barriers, or pits that extended these natural features, forming traps that relied on both knowledge of the landscape and collective effort. The moment of contact carried significant risk. A large animal, even when weakened or constrained, remained capable of powerful movement. Tusks, weight, and momentum could turn quickly, creating danger for those within close range. Injuries would not have been uncommon, and the outcome of such encounters could shift rapidly. Success depended not only on the initial approach, but on the ability to respond as the situation changed, adjusting movement and position in real time. These hunts were not frequent or routine, but events that required favorable conditions and careful planning. The energy gained from a successful hunt was substantial, providing food and materials that could support a group for an extended period. This potential made the risk worthwhile under the right circumstances, yet it did not remove the uncertainty that accompanied each attempt. Within the broader landscape, these interactions formed part of a larger relationship between humans and the animals around them. Hunting large prey represented one expression of this relationship, shaped by necessity, opportunity, and the limits of human capability. It reflected a balance between what could be achieved through cooperation and what remained beyond control. The traces left behind, fragments of bone, patterns of marks, and the placement of tools, offer a quiet record of these moments. They reveal not only the outcome, but the process, a sequence of actions carried out within a world where survival depended on understanding, coordination, and the willingness to face a scale far greater than the human body alone. Morning did not arrive with certainty, but with a gradual return of visibility, light spreading across the land and revealing what had changed during the night. For those moving within this world, each day began with a quiet assessment, subtle signs in the ground, shifts in air, and the distant presence of movement carried across space. Nothing was assumed to remain the same, and so attention settled into the smallest details before any step forward was taken. Travel unfolded slowly, shaped by both purpose and caution. Open ground allowed movement across long distances, yet it also offered little concealment. Each figure crossing that space became part of it, visible against the horizon, exposed to whatever else might be watching from afar. Groups moved together, maintaining proximity without clustering too tightly, spacing themselves in ways that allowed awareness to extend outward while still remaining connected. Paths were rarely fixed, adjusted instead by recent signs, weather, and the shifting patterns of animal activity. The senses carried much of this awareness. Sound moved differently across open terrain, traveling further, thinning as it spread, yet still carrying meaning. A distant impact, the rhythm of movement, or the sudden absence of expected noise could alter direction without hesitation. Scent, though less immediate, lingered in the air and on the ground, marking recent passage, signaling the presence of animals not yet visible. These cues were not interpreted in isolation, but woven together, forming a continuous understanding of the surroundings. Rest, when it came, was chosen carefully. Slight rises in the land offered broader visibility, allowing a clearer view of approaching movement. Natural barriers, where they existed, provided some degree of separation, though rarely complete. Fire, when maintained, extended this boundary, creating a zone that altered the behavior of nearby animals, its presence as much about shaping space as it was about warmth or light. Even in stillness, attention did not fade entirely, but settled into a quieter form, ready to respond if needed. Daily tasks were integrated into this constant awareness, gathering materials, preparing food, shaping tools, each action carried out within the context of the surrounding environment. Movement was often paused and resumed, not in rigid sequences, but in response to what the land revealed in each moment. Time was not measured in fixed intervals, but in changes of light, shifts in temperature, and the movement of animals across distance. Pressure was not always visible, yet it remained present, carried in the need to remain attentive, to adjust continuously. Weather could change without warning, altering conditions in ways that affected travel and survival. The presence of large animals, whether prey or predator, influenced where and how movement occurred. Even the ground itself could vary, firm in some areas, unstable in others, shaping the pace and direction of travel. Within this environment, life unfolded as a series of ongoing adjustments rather than fixed routines. Each decision, whether to move, to stop, to approach, or to avoid, was shaped by the immediate context, informed by experience and shared understanding. The world did not offer stillness for long, and so daily life became an act of continuous alignment, a steady response to a landscape defined by scale, movement, and the quiet persistence of change. The turning of the year was not subtle in this world, but marked by shifts that reshaped the land in cycles that returned again and again. Seasons carried distinct boundaries, each one altering the availability of resources and the conditions under which life could continue. These changes were not sudden, yet they were decisive, guiding movement, behavior, and survival across both animals and humans. Winter settled in with a gradual tightening of conditions. Temperatures dropped, and the surface of the land hardened, reducing access to food that lay beneath. Vegetation became scarce, and what remained was often concealed or difficult to reach. For many animals, this period demanded movement, a shift toward regions where conditions were slightly less severe or where resources persisted despite the cold. Herds began to travel, not randomly, but along paths shaped by memory and repetition, returning to areas that had supported them in previous cycles. For those that remained within colder regions, survival depended on adaptation. Thick coverings, stored energy, and behavioral adjustments allowed certain species to endure periods when food was limited. Activity often decreased, conserving energy during the most demanding intervals. Others relied on strategies that involved accessing hidden resources, breaking through surface layers, or feeding on vegetation that remained available despite the conditions. As winter receded, the land began to open again. Summer arrived not as a prolonged season, but as a brief interval of increased warmth and growth. Vegetation returned quickly, spreading across the ground in a concentrated burst of productivity. This period provided the resources necessary to support large populations, allowing animals to feed extensively and rebuild energy reserves. Movement continued during this time, though it was guided more by abundance than scarcity, with herds distributing themselves across areas where food was most accessible. Humans adapted to these cycles through a combination of movement and preparation. Their patterns of travel followed the availability of resources, aligning with the movements of animals and the changes in vegetation. During more productive periods, food could be gathered, hunted, and processed in ways that extended its use beyond immediate consumption. Drying, storing, and protecting food allowed groups to carry resources forward into less favorable times, reducing the uncertainty that accompanied seasonal shifts. Shelter and clothing also reflected these changes. Materials were selected and adapted to provide insulation during colder periods, while structures, though temporary, were positioned to reduce exposure to wind and other environmental factors. The use of fire became particularly important during winter, maintaining warmth and allowing continued activity even as external conditions limited movement. Scarcity was an expected part of this cycle, not an exception. Periods of reduced resources required careful management of what had been gathered or stored. Decisions about when to move, when to remain, and how to allocate available food were shaped by experience and shared knowledge. These choices influenced the stability of the group, determining whether it could endure until conditions improved again. Within this rhythm, life unfolded in response to the shifting balance between abundance and limitation. Each season carried its own demands, shaping behavior across species and guiding the flow of movement across the land. The repetition of these cycles created a structure within which survival was not fixed, but continuously adjusted, aligned with the changing conditions that defined this world. Before anything comes into view, there is often a shift in what can be heard, a change in the texture of the air that carries information long before shapes become visible. In this world, sound moved differently, stretched across open distances, thinning as it traveled, yet still holding enough detail to signal presence. The land itself became an instrument, transmitting movement through subtle vibrations, allowing events far beyond sight to leave faint impressions in the senses. Large animals altered this soundscape in ways that were not always immediate. Their movement, though steady, produced a rhythm that traveled through the ground as much as through the air. A distant herd could be sensed not as a clear image, but as a sequence of soft impacts, each step contributing to a pattern that repeated across time. These low, spreading signals reached outward, blending with the natural sounds of the environment, creating layers that required attention to separate and understand. Wind moved freely across the open terrain, uninterrupted by dense structures that might otherwise absorb or redirect it. Its passage created a continuous presence, a shifting background that filled the spaces between more distinct sounds. At times, it carried loose particles across the surface, producing a faint, steady friction against the ground. At other moments, it rose and fell, altering its intensity and direction, shaping how other sounds were heard or obscured. Silence, in this setting, was not the absence of sound, but a change in expectation. When familiar patterns faded or ceased, the absence itself carried meaning. A region that had been active might become still, or a distant rhythm might stop without clear cause. These shifts required interpretation, as they could indicate movement beyond perception or a transition in the behavior of nearby animals. In this way, silence functioned as part of the soundscape, contributing to the understanding of the environment rather than existing outside it. Scale influenced how these sounds were experienced. In a landscape where distances extended far beyond immediate reach, the relationship between source and perception changed. A movement that occurred far away could still be detected, though altered by distance, its details softened or dispersed. The size of the animals producing these sounds amplified their presence. allowing their actions to register across space in ways that smaller creatures could not replicate. For humans moving within this environment, listening became a continuous process, integrated into every moment of activity. Sound provided information that could not be obtained through sight alone, offering insight into the movement and behavior of other species. It guided decisions, influencing direction and pace, shaping how space was navigated and understood. At the same time, the vastness of the land introduced uncertainty. Sounds could travel in unexpected ways, carried by shifting air or reflected across surfaces, creating impressions that required careful interpretation. What seemed distant might be closer than expected, or what appeared near might have originated far away. This complexity added depth to the experience of the environment, where perception was shaped not only by what was present, but by how it was transmitted across space. Within this layered field of sound and silence, the scale of the world became more apparent, not through sight alone, but through the way it was heard, carried, and understood across distances that extended far beyond immediate view. At the center of a temporary camp, there would often be a contained glow, low at first, then steady, held within a boundary shaped by careful placement. Fire did not appear as a constant presence across the land, but where it was maintained, it altered the immediate world in ways that extended beyond its visible light. It introduced a controlled element into an environment otherwise governed by broader forces, creating a small zone where conditions could be adjusted, however briefly. The heat it produced was direct and immediate, countering the surrounding cold that settled into the ground and air. Bodies gathered near it not only for warmth, but for the extension of activity beyond daylight. As light faded, the fire continued to illuminate a limited area, allowing movement, preparation, and interaction to continue within its reach. This extension of time, subtle yet meaningful, changed how the day was structured, creating intervals that did not depend entirely on the rising and setting of the sun. Cooking emerged as one of its most significant uses. Food exposed to heat transformed in texture and composition, becoming easier to consume and digest. This process expanded the range of what could be used as nourishment, allowing parts of animals and plants that might otherwise be difficult to process to become accessible. The act of cooking also altered how food was shared, often drawing individuals together around a common space where preparation and consumption occurred collectively. Fire influenced the behavior of other animals as well. Its presence introduced a boundary that many species avoided, not necessarily out of immediate fear, but due to unfamiliarity and the unpredictability of heat and light. This created a form of separation, a perimeter that reduced the likelihood of close approach during periods of rest. The flicker of flames and the shifting patterns of light added complexity to the surrounding environment, making it more difficult for other animals to interpret or move through without hesitation. Maintaining fire required attention and continuity. It was not a resource that could be assumed to persist without effort. Fuel had to be gathered, arranged, and replenished, and the flame itself needed to be protected from conditions that could extinguish it. Knowledge of how to preserve embers, how to rekindle flame, and how to transport it between locations became part of the shared understanding within groups. This knowledge allowed fire to remain a consistent tool rather than a temporary occurrence. Evidence of controlled fire appears in the remains of hearths, areas where repeated burning has left distinct traces in the soil. Charcoal fragments, ash layers, and altered stones indicate locations where fire was used over time, not as isolated events, but as part of a recurring pattern. These sites often align with other signs of human activity, suggesting that fire was integrated into daily life rather than reserved for specific occasions. Within the broader landscape, fire represented a form of influence that extended beyond the immediate moment. It allowed humans to adjust their surroundings in small but meaningful ways, shaping how space was used and experienced. Its light, warmth, and transformative properties created a focal point around which activity could organize, offering a measure of stability within an environment defined by change. In this way, fire became more than a tool. It functioned as a connection between knowledge and survival, carried forward through practice, sustained through attention, and woven into the rhythm of life within a world that remained vast and largely unchanged beyond its reach. Long after movement has passed, the ground can retain a quiet memory, impressions pressed into soft surfaces and later held in place as conditions shift around them. In certain places, these marks remained, preserved beneath layers of sediment, protected from erosion, and carried forward across thousands of years. What began as a momentary contact between foot and earth became a lasting record, a trace of presence that no longer exists except in these subtle forms. Fossilized footprints appear in sequences that reveal more than simple direction. They show spacing, depth, and orientation, each detail contributing to an understanding of how an individual or group moved through the landscape. A deeper impression might suggest weight or a pause, while lighter marks indicate a more continuous motion. When multiple sets of tracks intersect, they form patterns that reflect interaction, not necessarily direct, but shared in time and space. Human footprints, preserved alongside those of animals, offer a particularly detailed view of coexistence. In some locations, these tracks appear in close proximity, suggesting that humans and large animals moved through the same area within a similar time frame. The arrangement of steps can indicate whether movement was steady or cautious, whether individuals were traveling alone or within a group. Variations in size among the prints reflect differences in age, pointing to the presence of both adults and younger members moving together. Animal tracks contribute their own layer of information. The spacing between steps, the depth of impressions, and the direction of travel all provide insight into behavior. A sequence that tightens or changes direction may indicate a shift in response, while parallel tracks suggest coordinated movement within a herd. Predatory species leave patterns that differ from those of herbivores, reflecting differences in gait, weight distribution, and interaction with the ground. Certain sites preserve these records with unusual clarity, often due to specific environmental conditions at the time the tracks were formed. Wet surfaces that later dried, fine sediments that hardened without disturbance, or layers that were quickly covered by additional material all contributed to the preservation of these impressions. In such locations, entire sequences can be observed, extending across a surface and capturing moments that unfolded over short spans of time. These preserved interactions reveal movement across landscapes in a way that bones alone cannot. While skeletal remains indicate presence, footprints record action. They show not only that an animal existed, but how it moved, how it adjusted its path, and how it related to others within its environment. When human and animal tracks appear together, they offer a glimpse into shared space, where different species occupied the same ground under similar conditions. The arrangement of these tracks can also suggest patterns of travel, routes that may have been used repeatedly, or paths that aligned with features of the landscape, such as water sources or natural corridors. Over time, such patterns would have guided movement, shaping how both humans and animals navigated their surroundings. In this quiet archive, the ground itself becomes a record of life in motion. Each preserved step carries information that extends beyond the moment it was made, contributing to a broader understanding of how beings moved, interacted, and existed within a world defined by constant change. Within fragments that appear silent and unremarkable, there exists a record far smaller than bone or footprint, yet capable of carrying details that extend beyond visible form. Ancient DNA remains preserved in places where conditions slowed decay, within the dense structure of bone, in the interior of teeth, and even within layers of ice that held biological material in suspended states. These fragments are not complete in the way living systems once were, but they retain sequences that can be read, compared, and interpreted. Extraction of this material requires careful handling, as time has broken it into smaller pieces and introduced changes through natural processes. Even so, enough remains in certain samples to allow reconstruction of genetic patterns. By isolating and sequencing these fragments, scientists can begin to assemble partial genomes, identifying relationships between extinct species and those that continue to exist. This process does not restore the organism itself, but it reveals the structure that once guided its development, offering a view into characteristics that are otherwise inaccessible. Through these reconstructions, differences between species become clearer. Variations in genes associated with hair, fat storage, or metabolism can be identified, providing insight into how certain animals adapted to their environments. In the case of cold-adapted species, genetic markers reflect the development of insulating features and physiological processes suited to lower temperatures. These details extend beyond what can be observed in fossilized remains alone, adding depth to the understanding of how form and function were connected. Ancient DNA also contributes to the study of population dynamics. By comparing sequences from different individuals across time and location, patterns begin to emerge. Genetic diversity can be measured, indicating whether populations were stable, expanding, or in decline. A reduction in diversity often signals a contraction, where fewer individuals contributed to subsequent generations. Such patterns can be traced alongside environmental changes, suggesting links between shifting conditions and the viability of species. In some cases, DNA recovered from ice cores or preserved sediments provides information about entire ecosystems rather than individual organisms. Fragments from plants, animals, and microorganisms become part of a layered record, revealing which species were present at different points in time. This approach allows for the reconstruction of past environments in a way that complements other forms of evidence, filling gaps where physical remains may be limited. The development of these methods represents a significant shift in how the past is studied. Where earlier approaches relied primarily on visible structures, the analysis of genetic material introduces a new dimension, one that operates at a scale beyond direct observation. Advances in sequencing technology have made it possible to process smaller and more degraded samples, expanding the range of what can be examined. Within this framework, ancient DNA becomes a quiet archive, one that preserves not only the identity of species, but the changes they underwent over time. It reveals connections between populations, traces pathways of adaptation, and records the gradual processes that led to both persistence and disappearance. These insights, drawn from fragments held within bone and ice, extend the narrative of the past into a level of detail that continues to unfold as methods improve and new samples are studied. The changes did not announce themselves all at once, but arrived as small adjustments that accumulated over time, subtle enough to pass unnoticed, in a single season, yet unmistakable when viewed across many years. Temperatures began to rise, not in a smooth progression, but in irregular intervals, brief phases of warmth, followed by returns to cooler conditions. Within this pattern, the overall direction shifted, and the balance that had defined the landscape for so long began to move. Ice that had remained stable for extended periods started to withdraw. The edges of glaciers softened, their boundaries no longer fixed in place. Meltwater gathered along their margins, forming channels that carried water outward, reshaping the ground as they flowed. As the ice receded, surfaces that had long been covered became exposed, revealing soil that had not interacted with air or light for thousands of years. These newly uncovered areas did not remain empty for long, as plants gradually established themselves, marking the first stages of ecological change. The distribution of vegetation began to adjust in response to these shifts. Areas that had supported certain types of plant life under colder conditions became less suitable, while others expanded into spaces that had previously been restricted. This movement did not occur evenly, but followed local variations in temperature, moisture, and soil composition. Over time, these changes altered the structure of the landscape, creating new combinations of habitats and reducing the extent of those that had once been widespread. Animals that had adapted to earlier conditions encountered these changes as a gradual but persistent pressure. For large species, whose survival depended on specific patterns of vegetation and movement across broad areas, even small shifts in the environment could have significant effects. Routes that had been reliable sources of food began to change, and the timing of seasonal availability became less predictable. In response, populations adjusted their movement, extending into new areas or concentrating in regions where conditions remained favorable. This period did not represent a sudden loss, but a transformation that unfolded across generations. Some species were able to adapt to the new conditions, altering their behavior or expanding into different environments. Others experienced a narrowing of their range, their populations becoming more limited as suitable habitats decreased. The scale of these changes was not always immediately visible, but it was recorded in the gradual redistribution of life across the landscape. Water systems also shifted as the ice retreated. Rivers altered their courses, lakes formed and drained, and the balance between wet and dry regions changed. These adjustments influenced both plant growth and animal movement, adding another layer to the ongoing transformation. The land, once shaped primarily by the presence of ice, began to take on new forms defined by flowing water and emerging vegetation. Within this evolving environment, the stability that had supported large, established systems gave way to a more dynamic state. Conditions continued to change, not abruptly, but with a persistence that reshaped the relationships between species and their surroundings. The world remained recognizable, yet its structure was no longer fixed in the same way. In this quiet progression, the beginning of a different era emerged, carried not by a single event, but by the accumulation of changes that, over time, redefined the conditions under which life continued to exist. The absence did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual thinning, a quiet reduction in presence that unfolded differently across regions and species. At first, the change might have been difficult to notice, a herd smaller than before, a familiar path less frequently used. Over time, these small shifts accumulated, forming a pattern that would only become clear when compared against what had once been constant. The decline of large animals did not follow a uniform timeline. In some areas, populations began to diminish earlier, while in others, they persisted for longer periods before fading. Across continents, the sequence of disappearance varied, shaped by local conditions, climate shifts, and the presence of human populations. Some species that had once been widespread became restricted to smaller regions. Their numbers reduced gradually rather than abruptly. In North America, many large mammals appear to have declined within a relatively narrow span of time, though the exact pace of this process remains a subject of careful study. Fossil records suggest that several species disappeared within overlapping intervals, leaving behind remains that mark their final presence in the geological record. In contrast, other regions show a more extended pattern, where certain species persisted longer, surviving in isolated areas before eventually disappearing. This uneven pattern reflects the complexity of the forces involved. Climate changes altered habitats and resource availability, shifting the conditions that had supported large animals for thousands of years. At the same time, human populations continued to expand, introducing new pressures through hunting and competition for space. The interaction between these factors did not produce a single outcome, but a range of responses that varied across species and locations. Some animals appear to have been more resilient, adapting to changing conditions for longer periods before their eventual decline. Others, more specialized in their requirements, may have been less able to adjust, their populations decreasing more rapidly as their environments shifted. The fossil record captures these differences in fragments, bones found in different layers, each representing a point along the timeline of presence and disappearance. Scientific understanding of this process continues to develop, shaped by new discoveries and methods of analysis. Radiocarbon dating allows for more precise placement of remains within time, while genetic studies provide insight into population size and diversity leading up to extinction. These approaches reveal patterns that are not always consistent, suggesting that multiple factors contributed in varying degrees rather than a single cause. Debate remains an integral part of this understanding. Some interpretations emphasize the role of climate, pointing to the broad environmental changes that occurred during this period. Others focus on human activity, highlighting evidence of hunting and interaction. Increasingly, perspectives consider the combination of both, recognizing that the overlap of these influences may have created conditions that were difficult for large species to withstand. What emerges from this ongoing study is not a simple narrative, but a layered one, where decline unfolds through a series of interconnected changes. The giants of this world did not vanish all at once, nor for a single reason, but through a process that varied in pace and form, leaving behind traces that continue to inform the understanding of how such a transformation occurred. Explanations for this quiet disappearance do not settle into a single line, but branch outward, each path shaped by different forms of evidence drawn from the same fading record. Within these interpretations, two forces appear repeatedly, sometimes standing apart, sometimes overlapping, each offering a way to understand how such a widespread change could unfold across the living world. One perspective centers on the influence of human hunting, not as isolated events, but as a sustained interaction carried across generations. The presence of tools alongside large animal remains, the patterns of cut marks on bone, and the distribution of sites where processing occurred all suggest that humans were capable of taking down even the largest species under certain conditions. Over time, repeated removal of individuals from already shifting populations could have contributed to a gradual reduction, especially in species with slower reproduction rates. In this view, even a modest level of hunting, applied consistently, becomes significant when extended across wide regions and long periods. Another perspective emphasizes the role of climate, pointing to the changes that were already underway as temperatures rose and environments transformed. As vegetation patterns shifted, the availability of food altered in both timing and distribution. Habitats that had supported large animals for thousands of years began to fragment or change in character, placing pressure on species adapted to more stable conditions. Water systems adjusted, migration routes became less predictable, and the balance between different forms of life began to shift in response to these environmental changes. Evidence supporting this view comes from the alignment of extinction timelines with periods of rapid climate fluctuation, where multiple species show signs of stress even in regions with limited evidence of human interaction. Genetic studies indicating declining population diversity before final disappearance also suggest that some species were already under pressure, their numbers reduced before other factors were introduced. Increasingly, these perspectives are not treated as separate explanations, but as parts of a combined process. Climate change may have altered ecosystems in ways that reduced resilience, making populations more vulnerable to additional pressures. Within this altered landscape, human hunting could have had a greater impact than it might have under more stable conditions. The interaction between these forces creates a scenario where neither alone fully accounts for the outcome, but together they form a more comprehensive understanding. Supporting this combined view are patterns that vary across regions. In some areas, the arrival of humans appears closely aligned with the timing of species decline, while in others, environmental changes seem to play a more prominent role. The lack of uniformity suggests that local conditions influenced how these factors interacted, producing different outcomes depending on the balance between them. The evidence itself remains incomplete, composed of fragments that must be interpreted within broader contexts. Fossil records, archaeological sites, and genetic data each contribute pieces to the overall picture, yet none provide a complete account on their own. As new methods refine the ability to date, analyze, and compare these sources, the understanding continues to evolve, revealing a process that is layered and interconnected. Within this complexity, the disappearance of large animals emerges not as the result of a single cause, but as a convergence of influences, each shaping the conditions under which survival became increasingly difficult until the balance could no longer be maintained. On the edges of retreating worlds, there are often places where remnants remain, small continuations of what once extended across vast distances. These are not separate creations, but fragments held apart by changing conditions, where populations persist in isolation after the broader landscape has shifted beyond them. In the final stages of the Age of Giants, such isolated groups became the last carriers of forms that had once defined entire ecosystems. Separation occurred gradually as environments transformed and connections between regions were lost. Rising waters, shifting vegetation, and altered migration pathways reduced the continuity that had allowed large populations to move freely. In certain areas, groups of animals became confined to specific locations where conditions still supported their survival. These populations did not represent the full scale of what had once existed, but smaller, more limited continuations shaped by the boundaries that had formed around them. One of the most well-known examples is found on Wrangel Island, a remote landmass in the Arctic where woolly mammoths persisted long after they had disappeared from mainland regions. Isolated by rising sea levels, the island provided a refuge where the environmental conditions remained suitable for a time. Here, a population continued to exist, carrying forward a lineage that had once ranged across continents. Their presence extended the timeline of their species, creating a final chapter that unfolded separately from the broader pattern of decline. Within such isolated populations, genetic changes began to accumulate in ways that differed from larger, more connected groups. With fewer individuals contributing to each generation, genetic diversity decreased, a process often described as a bottleneck. This reduction in variation can limit the ability of a population to adapt to new challenges, making it more vulnerable to changes in environment, disease, or random events. Over time, these effects become more pronounced, influencing both physical traits and overall resilience. Evidence of these processes appears in genetic studies, where sequences from late surviving individuals show signs of reduced diversity compared to earlier populations. Mutations that might have been diluted within larger groups become more prominent, and the overall structure of the population reflects its constrained size. These patterns provide insight into the final stages of survival, revealing how isolation, while offering temporary refuge, can also introduce new limitations. The final disappearance of these last populations did not occur simultaneously, or for a single reason. In some cases, environmental conditions may have shifted beyond what the remaining groups could endure. In others, additional pressures, including human presence, may have contributed to their decline. The exact sequence of events varies, but the outcome remains consistent: the eventual loss of the last individuals within each isolated population. These final moments are preserved in fragments, bones found in remote locations, genetic material extracted from preserved remains, and the absence of any later traces. Together, they mark the end of lineages that had persisted through extensive periods of change, adapting and surviving across vast stretches of time before narrowing into their final forms. In this closing phase, the giants did not vanish all at once, but receded into smaller and more distant places, their presence fading as isolation limited their continuation, until only the record of their existence remained, carried forward in the traces they left behind. What followed did not arrive as a sudden replacement, but as a gradual reshaping, where familiar forms gave way to new arrangements that settled into place over time. As temperatures continued to rise, the balance between different types of vegetation shifted, and with it, the structure of entire landscapes began to change. Areas that had once supported open, continuous ground started to fill in, not all at once, but through steady expansion. Trees advanced into regions where conditions had previously limited their growth. Seeds carried by wind, water, and animals took root in newly suitable soils, and over successive seasons, young growth established itself. As these plants matured, they altered the environment around them, creating shade, retaining moisture, and influencing the composition of the soil. This process encouraged further growth, allowing forests to spread outward and upward, gradually replacing the more open forms of vegetation that had dominated earlier. With this expansion came the contraction of grasslands that had once stretched across vast distances. The wide spaces that had supported large herds began to fragment, their continuity broken by the presence of increasing tree cover. Movement across these areas changed as pathways narrowed and visibility decreased. The conditions that had favored large, wide-ranging animals became less common, replaced by environments that supported different patterns of life. As these changes unfolded, the composition of animal populations began to adjust. Smaller species, often more adaptable to varied conditions, became more prominent. Their size allowed them to navigate the increasingly complex structure of the landscape, moving through denser vegetation and utilizing resources that were distributed in smaller, more localized patches. In contrast, many larger species, which had depended on extensive, open environments and consistent patterns of movement, found their range reduced. This transition did not occur in isolation. The interactions between species shifted alongside the physical changes in the land. Predators adapted to environments where concealment became more feasible, altering their strategies in response to new conditions. Herbivores adjusted their feeding patterns, focusing on different types of vegetation that became available as plant communities changed. Each of these adjustments contributed to a broader restructuring, where the relationships between species evolved in response to the transformed landscape. Water systems also played a role in this process. As forests expanded, they influenced how water moved through the environment, affecting soil, moisture, runoff, and the formation of new habitats. Wetlands developed in some areas, while others became more stable in their composition, supporting a range of plant and animal life suited to these conditions. The interplay between vegetation and water further reinforced the shift away from the earlier, more open world. Over time, these changes accumulated into a new arrangement that, while continuous with what had come before, differed in structure and function. The dominance of large, open ecosystems gave way to a more varied landscape where diversity emerged through complexity rather than scale. The giants that had once shaped the land through their movement and presence were no longer central to its form, replaced by systems that operated through smaller interactions distributed across the environment. In this quiet transformation, the world did not lose its vitality, but redefined it, settling into patterns that would carry forward into the present, shaped by the gradual interplay of climate, vegetation, and the life that adapted within it. There are places in this story where the record grows thin, where the continuity of evidence softens and gives way to intervals that are only partially understood. In these spaces, knowledge does not disappear, but becomes incomplete, shaped by what has been preserved and what has been lost. The remains that reach the present are fragments of a larger whole, and between them lie stretches of time that must be approached with careful interpretation. Fossils, though central to understanding the past, do not form a continuous archive. Their presence depends on specific conditions, where remains are buried, protected, and eventually revealed. Many organisms leave no trace at all, and even those that do are often represented by isolated finds rather than complete sequences. As a result, the patterns that can be observed are uneven, with certain regions and time periods more clearly defined than others. These gaps do not invalidate what is known, but they limit the precision with which events can be reconstructed. Within these limitations, key questions remain open. The exact sequence of changes that led to the disappearance of large species cannot always be traced in detail, and the relative influence of different factors continues to be examined. Some timelines appear compressed, suggesting rapid transitions, while others extend across longer intervals, indicating a more gradual process. The variation between these patterns invites ongoing study, as each new piece of evidence has the potential to refine or adjust existing interpretations. Advances in scientific methods continue to expand what can be learned from the available record. Techniques for analyzing ancient DNA have revealed information that was once inaccessible, allowing researchers to explore genetic diversity, population size, and relationships between species. Chemical signatures preserved in sediments and ice provide additional context, offering insights into environmental conditions and changes over time. These approaches add depth to the understanding of past ecosystems, connecting physical remains with broader environmental patterns. At the same time, new discoveries continue to emerge from locations that have not yet been fully explored. Each site contributes its own set of data, sometimes reinforcing established ideas, sometimes introducing unexpected elements that prompt reevaluation. The process of discovery is ongoing, shaped by both deliberate investigation and the chance exposure of materials that have remained hidden. Future research is guided by the recognition that understanding is always provisional, open to revision as new information becomes available. Efforts to integrate different forms of evidence, from fossils to genetic data to environmental records, aim to create a more complete picture of how these systems functioned and how they changed. This integration requires careful coordination, as each type of evidence carries its own limitations and strengths. In this evolving field, the unknown is not an absence, but a space of possibility, where questions continue to shape the direction of study. The story of this world remains partially unfinished, not because it cannot be known, but because it is still being assembled, piece by piece, through the ongoing work of uncovering and understanding the traces that remain. Time does not hold landscapes in place, even when they appear stable within a single lifetime. The ground, the climate, the living systems that move across them all continue to shift, guided by processes that extend far beyond immediate perception. What feels familiar is often only a brief arrangement, one expression within a longer sequence that continues to unfold whether observed or not. The world described across these passages existed not in a distant, unreachable past, but within a span of time that remains close when measured against the scale of Earth's history. The difference between that world and this one is not marked by an immeasurable divide, but by a series of changes that accumulated until the structure of life itself took on a different form. The presence of large animals, the patterns of movement, the relationships between species, all belong to a configuration that no longer persists in the same way. Yet nothing within that world was fixed. The conditions that supported it were already in motion, gradually shifting as climate, geography, and life interacted. The disappearance of those systems did not require a singular event, but emerged from the same processes that had once allowed them to exist. Change, in this sense, is not an interruption, but a continuation where each phase carries the potential to transform into another. The evidence of this earlier world remains, not as a complete reconstruction, but as traces embedded within the earth itself. Beneath layers of soil and sediment, bones and fragments record the forms that once moved across open ground. These remains do not speak in direct narratives, but in patterns that can be read, interpreted, and connected. Through them, the outline of that world becomes visible, not as a static image, but as a dynamic system that once operated under different conditions. To consider this past is to recognize that the present arrangement of life is only one version among many that have existed. The absence of those earlier forms does not erase their influence, as the structures that followed were shaped, in part, by what came before. Ecosystems reorganized, species adapted, and new balances emerged, all within the continuity of the same planet. There is a quiet proximity to this history. The distance between then and now is measured in thousands of years, a span that, while significant in human terms, remains brief within the broader context of geological time. This closeness allows the past to remain tangible, not only through scientific study, but through the realization that the ground beneath any given place may hold remnants of that earlier world. Within this perspective, The transformation of Earth becomes a continuous process rather than a completed event. What has changed once can change again, guided by forces that operate across scales both vast and subtle. The story of the giants, of the environments that sustained them, and of their eventual disappearance is part of this larger pattern, one chapter within an ongoing sequence. In this reflection, the lost world does not stand apart as something entirely separate, but remains connected to the present through the traces it has left behind, existing not only in memory, but in the material record that continues to shape the understanding of how Earth has been and how it continues to become.